Não tá rolando, né?
Isa?
Também, né, gente? Sabia que a TIM foi reconhecida como a melhor experiência de vídeo e videochamada do Brasil?
Como assim?
Assim, ó. Na rede TIM você tem a melhor experiência de reunião de família, de risada contagiante, de namoro à distância. Rede TIM. Pode contar. E agora com 5G.
So, good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank my friends at ABDF, Gustavo Bigagao, Heleno Torres, Marcos Catao, Andre, of course, and many others, and the organizing committee for basically giving me this opportunity to physically address you after 2.5 years. I think the last physical Congress was 3 years. It feels actually good not to be talking just to my laptop and to see actual people, many of which I recognize from previous IFA events. I apologize to the members of our panel as well, or most distinguished speaker, for starting pretty late. Some of them do have other obligations, and I hope they can stay with us as long as they can. What we will be talking about today is the minimum tax, otherwise known as Pillar 2. It is very important. I realize that it's not really living in Brazil, but it is very, very important. Together with Pillar 1, is supposed to be probably the most important remodeling of the international tax architecture, not in a generation, but maybe in the last 100 years. The speakers join me. I will introduce them as they start their own contributions. We have Stephen Kohart from the OECD, Roberta, who is from Spain, David Rosenbloom, who is very well known to many of you, Porus, Kaka, who is also very well known to many of you, and last but not least, Diego Salto from Costa Rica. All right. What are we talking about really? We're talking about a minimum tax that would apply to in-scope companies, companies which have 750 million turnover in euro. And the idea, the target date for these rules to start is 2013, 2014, but that seems to be a long shot. It doesn't look like it would start there. The EU already has delayed its projected starting date to 2014, 2015. It is pretty complicated. I mean, the rule itself, the logic itself is pretty simple. Every company, multinational group within the scope should have an effective tax rate of 15%. But to get there are many, many steps, and it's pretty complicated. And fortunately, we have with us to start this panel. We have with us Stephen. Stephen Kohart is a business and law graduate at the same time. And basically, to introduce him is very simple. If you want to put a face to the minimum tax, that's your man, right? So if you like it, if you like the minimum tax, you will like him. If you don't, sorry, Stephen, but you will have a problem. So, Stephen, I mean, what are we talking about? This is historically, these things, I mean, people of my generation even can still think of the Primorolo report. We were talking about having a minimum tax in the framework of tax competition, basically, right? Then the US administration, I think in the times of the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, at one point they said, no, we don't want this. and the OECD moved to basically transparency and exchange of information. And here, 30 years later, we are back. So my first thing would be to ask, okay, what is it exactly? This is like a hybrid. I mean, is it a BEPS measure, or is it a anti-tax competition, anti-tax harmful practices measure? And how are you going to achieve it, basically?
Sure. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak this morning. And perhaps what I can do here is provide a bit of an overview of the rules, how they're intended to work, how they're designed to work, and what we're talking about in a little bit more detail. As you pointed out, Pillar 2 is a set of interlocking rules. It has the subject to tax rule as well as the GLOBE rules. And together, these rules exactly operate to ensure that M&E groups are subject to a minimum level of taxation in the jurisdictions in which they operate. So in addition to ensuring that minimum level of tax in each jurisdiction in which a group operates, it does also set a floor. It does set a floor for tax competition at that minimum rate. The subject to tax rule is a treaty-based provision that's still undergoing development, but essentially applies first in time and targets payments between connected persons with a high risk of base erosion when there's a developing country essentially in play. It's essentially a simple to administer rule for developing economies, and this applies first in time with a 9% nominal rate test. Anything that is picked up under the subject to tax rule, that tax is a covered tax for purposes of the GLOBE. So when we're going to create or determine the effective tax rate for GLOBE purposes, we take that into account. And then the GLOBE rules, which I think is what everybody is the most focused on, have two parts. They have the income inclusion rule, which might look a little like a CFC rule to some of you, although it is quite different. And then the UTPR, which operates as a backstop when the IIR, the income inclusion rule, doesn't pick up what it needs to achieve that minimum level of taxation. It's important to note the GLOBE rules are designed to be implemented under domestic law as a common approach, applying to groups with 750 million euros or more of annual turnover. There are certain excluded. There are certain exclusions, certain types of pension and investment funds, international shipping, and so forth. But generally speaking, M&A groups of over 750 million euros are in scope. And the way the rule operates is to essentially calculate the profit for GLOBE purposes, starting with the financial accounts with certain adjustments in each jurisdiction in which the M&A group operates. The effective tax rate is then calculated in the jurisdiction. And to the extent that effective tax rate falls below that minimum rate of 15%, top-up tax under Pillar 2 is applied in that situation to bring the jurisdiction up to the 15% minimum rate on the GLOBE income. So perhaps I'll pause there, Dali, and pass it back to you. I certainly have more background that I'd be happy to go through, but I know you had some other questions as well. So perhaps this is a good point for me to pause.
So if I could sum it up, and don't take me wrong, but I think if there is an Oscar for abbreviations and acronyms that should go to anybody, it should go to OECD. So, so we start with GLOBE, all right? And then with the GLOBE, what do we have? We have something which is called USTR, which applies basically more or less autonomously from the GLOBE rules, right? And that would allow the source countries to levy a withholding tax of between 7.5% and 9% on specified income paid to low tax jurisdictions, but that would be a treaty rule. That would be only under treaties, and it would actually override existing treaty rules, correct? If the effective tax rate in the relevant jurisdiction is still below 15%, then we have a top-up tax, right? And that top-up tax, it comes in 3 different variants, right? The first variant would be the qualified domestic top-up tax, right? Then
exactly. I'm happy to touch on that as well if you'd like. I wasn't sure how far
Yeah.
But absolutely happy to explain a little bit about that as well before we.
All right. But let's say, so we have the qualified domestic top-up tax. If that's not enough, we have the IIR, which is the income inclusion rule. And that IIR, basically, maybe to a Brazilian audience, it functions pretty much like a CFC, right? And then we have the UTPR, so basically the IIR is for the country of the ultimate parent company, which can levy that IIR. And if that's not enough, we go down the chain with the UTPR, the under-tax payment rule, correct?
Exactly. And the ideal scenario is that the income inclusion rule should, to the extent that there's a jurisdiction high in the ownership chain that has adopted a qualified income inclusion rule, it really limits the circumstances in which the UTPR applies or should operate to do that.
Great.
So that's the goal.
Great.
But so, exactly, if there are jurisdictions in the chain that aren't applying qualified IIR, or with respect to the parent jurisdiction itself, the UTPR does come into play. Exactly right.
And I suppose you expect most jurisdictions to introduce the qualified domestic top-up tax, because otherwise, basically, you are giving your own taxes to the next country, right?
I think we've seen a lot of interest from jurisdictions in adopting a qualified domestic minimum top-up tax. And just a bit of background on that for the audience, to the extent helpful. What a qualified domestic minimum top-up tax does is it operates first in time to collect the top-up tax locally in the jurisdiction that would otherwise be applicable under the globe rules with respect to the low tax outcome in that jurisdiction.
Okay, great. Just for a Brazilian audience, and by the way, we have really very, very important audience. We had, I don't know, maybe around 300 people in the room, and close to 3,000 in total. So for a Brazilian audience, let's say that they have now their CFC legislation, right? And Brazilian CFC legislation is pretty broad. Basically, it catches almost everything. Now, if let's say I am in Cayman, and I introduced a qualified, I really have to get used to the acronyms, QDTT, Qualified Domestic Top-Up Tax. Then can Brazil, after that, still apply its CFC legislation to in-scope companies, or that's done? They cannot apply it anymore.
So the CFC rules will come first in time. So the globe rules don't alter the CFC rules that are applied by any jurisdiction. And in fact, in the globe rules, there's a mechanism in which to take CFC taxes into account, and then in certain cases, allocate those taxes back down for purposes of calculating the effective tax rate to the CFC jurisdiction. There are certain limitations on that, of course.
No, but Stephen, now let's assume that I've added the CFC tax and I got to 15%.
It would depend. It would depend whether that CFC tax. So if a Brazilian entity is picking up a CFC charge on its foreign subsidiaries, under the rules, we will generally allocate that CFC tax down to the foreign subsidiary, and it'll be a covered tax in that jurisdiction. There are certain limitations on that, and to the extent one of those limitations applies, any remaining CFC tax that's not allocated would stay in the Brazil jurisdiction under the rules.
All right, great. Well, thank you. I think you've explained it very well, and maybe I could just move to Roberta. You're there?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm
Hi, Roberta.
here.
Thank you for joining us. So just to introduce Roberta, she's the partner in charge of international tax at Pricewaterhouse in Spain.
Yep.
She used to be the director of international tax at the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and has also worked with the European Union, with the Commission, and with the delegation of Spain to the European Commission. But I think the best introduction I would make for Roberta today is that she's also on the board of WIN, women in IFA, branch of IFA, which is doing great work, actually. So thanks for joining us, Roberta, and again, also apologies to you for starting late. Roberta is going to tell us about the EU perspective. So basically the day I think Stephen has announced the rules, the next day the EU came up with a directive. And Stephen did not speak to the EU, I think. There was Chinese war between both. So it was quite surprising for the EU to come up with rules just 24 hours later. So what do these rules say? I understand that the EU is trying to introduce this minimum tax within the European Union in a harmonized way. So for basically all 27 countries through a directive. So why through a directive to start with? And what's the EU trying to do? Just for the audience, 1 minute. A directive, basically there are two different instruments for the implementation of positive EU law, right? One is called the regulation, and the other is called the directive. A regulation basically is something that applies automatically. The countries, you know, they agree to it in the European framework, and then it enters into force. It has legal force in every member state from the date agreed to, without that the country has to do anything. It just applies right away. A directive simply gives rather an objective for the member states to reach, and the member states have to implement that in the form of directive. Roberta.
Yes, well, thank you, Dali, and good morning, everyone. And well, first of all, thank you to the association for giving me the opportunity to talk here. So the situation, what is the context in Spain? So it is, as Dali has introduced it, in Europe. Well, I think first maybe I should say that we have in Europe some of the main promoters of the minimum tax, because some of the EU countries like France and Germany have been one of the countries that have been pushing for the adoption of this minimum taxation. It's true that this is not the situation of all EU member states, but in general, we can say that all EU member states may agree to this minimum tax, because in fact, all of them, except one, so 26 out of 27 of the EU countries adopted the model rules published by the OECD under the inclusive framework. And there is only one, that is Cyprus, that didn't sign for the model rules, but more for a political issue. And in fact, Cyprus has publicly expressed its support for the rules and gave the approval to the directive last time it was discussed. So this first to give a little bit of background of what is the situation at the EU. And as you say, Dali, the plan at the EU is to transpose the model rules through a directive. For the adoption of the directive, we need unanimity. It is necessary to have all 27 countries voting in favor of these rules. Do we need a directive? Well, this is something that there has been a discussion on this, of course. Probably the first thing to notice is that tax is a competence of individual countries, of individual member states.
Yes.
And the competences of the Union are limited to some cases where there are obstacles to the internal market, to the internal European market, and we need these rules to fight these obstacles to the internal market. If this is the first condition, if this condition is met, then the EU can act, providing for a rule, in this case in the form of a directive. But there are also other requirements that these rules need to be proportionate, and there's also a need to comply with the subsidiarity principle. This implies that the Union can only act when individual countries by its own cannot reach the same result than if the rules were adopted by the Union. So these are probably two questions that need to be answered and that we don't have a clear answer because, first of all, are there obstacles to the internal market? Well, traditionally, the obstacles to the internal market have been understood to be those imposing a cross-border taxation, and in fact, there's no taxation.
Anything that distorts or has the potential to distort the internal market otherwise.
Yes, that is the main reason for acting in the EU on the area of taxation, and this has been like this for years. But after BEPS, it's true that the fight against abuse has been found to be also a good reason for the union to act. Is PR2 a rule intended to fight
I'm sorry,
against abuse?
Roberta, the union already has, okay, so for the anti-abuse, we have a number of rules now within the union. You know, we have ATAD, we have ATAD 1, ATAD 1. I don't know where we will end. We will end probably with ATAD 7. We have the state aid rules. There are enough instruments within the union in both sides. I mean, Stephen was saying that it is actually both a BEPS measure, but also has obviously implications for the harmful tax competition debate. The union has instruments for both.
The union has instruments for both, and these instruments have been adopted recently following BEPS. But this is the same for most of the countries that have adopted BEPS. Probably what we are looking for with this PR2 or minimum tax is a double objective. At the beginning, you referred to these rules as being hybrid, and I agree with that. Because first, it is putting a floor to tax competition, that this floor can be put even in cases when there is no abuse. But there is also part of the rules that is linked with an anti-abuse measure because we have the substance carved out. So if there is enough substance, we admit that the tax goes below the 15%. So coming back to the arguments for the union acting, wait, we need to have an obstacle. Is this an obstacle to the internal market? Well, we could argue on this. As I say, abuse has been found to be an obstacle. I think this is one step forward. For me, it's not that clear that this is that much an obstacle to the internal market. And I also have doubts on whether we comply with the principles of subsidiarity, because I think member states could act by their own. In fact, all countries outside of the EU are going to act individually.
Yes.
Having said that, it's going to be the parliaments, national parliaments are the ones that have to decide if a directive is the proper instrument to transpose PR2 at the EU.
Right. Okay. Where do you see basically the major, I would say, how shall I put it? The major areas of friction between the proposed rules, you know, the minimum tax framework as proposed now in the directive. By the way, the difference between the OECD proposed framework and the EU framework is that the EU framework also applies to companies which are purely domestic, right? That they don't have any cross-border affiliates. And that is to avoid anti-discrimination problems within the EU. All right. So where do you see the major friction points between the proposed rules and EU law and EU case law?
Okay, so the directive closely follows the model rules, and only some modifications have been introduced, as you say, and these modifications have been introduced precisely to avoid frictions with EU law. The main one being that the rules are applicable to domestic groups. It's not the only one, because there are also other differences between the model rules and the directive. For instance, in the directive, the income inclusion rule or the calculation of the 15% is going to be done also at the jurisdiction of the ultimate parent entity. That this is not the case under the model rules.
True.
So what could be the problem with EU law? The problem with EU law is if the rules are found to be discriminatory that treating differently or putting in a worse position non-resident taxpayer from resident taxpayer in a certain member state.
But that problem you avoid by having it applied domestically, right?
Yeah, that's it. In principle, the application of the rules domestically is intended to avoid this problem. Can we say with this that we can avoid any type of discrimination? Well, probably not, because we have to assess if there is a discrimination de jure or de facto, and these rules that are not going to be applicable exactly to all taxpayers.
Or between companies in scope and companies not in scope?
Yeah, that's one thing. Or it has also been said the jurisdictional blending. It is not the same to blend in a small country that to blend in a big country. It's not a very, very clear discrimination as could be domestic from cross-border, but well, we could think about situations where there is a discrimination. But even if there is a discrimination, this discrimination may be justified, but this justification has to be also proportionate with the objectives that it was intended to look for. And there is a consolidated jurisprudence of the European Court saying that the discriminations cannot go farther than the objectives that need to be achieved, need to be proportionate.
Definitely. Roberta, we already had problems with CFC in Europe, and we just were mentioning with Stephen that IIR, I mean, of course, it's a bit more than a CFC, but basically the mechanism is based on the philosophy of a CFC regime. We already had our CFC issues in the EU. We had Cadbury Schweppes, we had a number of other, and at the national level, you know, we had Schneider in France, you know, by the French Supreme Court, etc. If the the globe, let's put it this way, if it is included in a directive, then these problems disappear?
Well, it's more difficult that the European Court finds that a directive is discriminatory. In any case, to assess this, what needs to be analyzed is if there is going to be an exhaustive harmonization. Because if there is an exhaustive harmonization, because the directive gives you exactly what the member states have to incorporate in the national law, then it is the directive, the one that is going to be assessed against primary law, against the treaty. If the harmonization is not exhaustive, that could also be because there are options, then it is domestic national rules, the ones that need to be assessed if they comply with EU law.
Correct.
CFC rules, Cadbury Schweppes, as you say, have been, well, this was probably the most famous case on establishing limits to anti-abuse measures. And what the court says is that these rules can only be applied when there is a wholly artificial arrangement. We can probably say the same thing for income inclusion rule, but income inclusion rule will be applicable even without a wholly artificial arrangement.
Right.
So, first of all, there needs to be a discrimination. That in principle, the rules of the directive has been drafted to avoid this discrimination. But if we are able to find that there is a discrimination, probably we don't comply with the requirements to make this discrimination proportionate because there is no artificial arrangement in the income.
Because basically, it would be a conflict between secondary EU law and primary EU law. All right, with fundamental freedoms are primary EU law. So, just one last question, if I may, Roberta. We could discuss this for hours, but we also have, we just mentioned in the beginning, there is this subject to tax rule, right? Which would override treaties and allow the source country to levy withholding tax on specified low tax payments. Now, within the European Union, of course, we have the parent subsidiary directive and we have the interest and royalty directive, which prohibit the imposition of withholding tax on qualifying dividends on the one hand, interest and royalties on the other. Does that fit together?
As you say, there's so cross-border payments of dividends, interest, and royalties between EU countries cannot be subject to tax. So the subject to tax rule could not be imposed between EU countries. Having said that, it's true that the model rules, as they are now, these payments are not intended to be subject to the subject to tax rule, because it's only for payments coming from developing countries, and probably this is not the case for any of the EU countries, and this could be applicable. But in any case, there are conflicts with EU law that could also arise from other things. For instance, the ability to pay. There's a principle under the Charter of Fundamental Rights of ability to pay. The model rules in some cases lead to the payment of the top-up tax, even if there are losses. Even if a group has losses or a company has losses, there is a rule that establishes that if these losses are more than the global loss, because there's a permanent difference, maybe the company will have to pay the top-up tax. And in this case, it's going to be paying taxes even without having made a profit. So these are different things that maybe we could think that are conflicted, that maybe have a conflict.
One last thing. So the status now, the proposed directive is being discussed at the level of, I think, the council, at the level of the council. Poland is the last holdout. Poland is saying no. We want Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 together, or at least they want a binding legal thing that say that Pillar 2 would not apply without Pillar 1, or at least that Pillar 1, there would be a legal binding agreement to also introduce Pillar 1, which is more important for Poland, probably. So what's the situation now? We're still in that stalemate.
Yes, we're still in that situation. The next opportunity to vote for it is the next ECOFIN. So it's the meeting of the ministers of economic and finance that will take place.
That's
at the
in
end
June,
of this
right?
month.
In June?
No, it's in May. There's one in May and another one in June.
Oh, I
so
thought the
there's
May
one
already
each
took
month.
place. Okay.
No, not yet. So it will take place, I think it's next Tuesday. It's usually one Tuesday. I think it's next or the following Tuesday. So there will be another opportunity.
Do you know by chance? Do you know by chance who's the next presidency? I mean, now it's France, and France is really pushing hard. Who's the next one?
Yeah, the Czech Republic.
Oh, okay. So it will take maybe a bit longer. Right. All right. Thank you very much,
Roberta. One, and you're welcome.
Thank you so much. Let me move to David Rosenbloom. I think David does not really need an introduction here. In fact, he comes with a fan club within the room. David is, of course, has a very long and distinguished career in international tax. He has been with Treasury. He's been the International Tax Council with the US Treasury. And at that time, he's been the person who attempted to start the negotiation of tax treaty between the US and Brazil. And I think since then they decided if basically it didn't work for David, then let's forget about it, not try again. He is a partner of a major law firm in the US, Kaplan and Drysdale. And of course, he is the director of the International Tax Program of New York University School of Law, right? I was saying that David has a fan club because a lot of the, I would say, rising stars of international tax in Brazil today are his alumni, actually. And I know that in a sign of recognition of David as a distinguished educator and mentor, they just published a book in his honor. And I received a copy of that book. I have it here. I'll make sure I'll go through it. So first of all, congratulations to you, David, for the sign of recognition from your alumni. I think it's the best that can overcome an international tax professional, is to be recognized by, as an educator and mentor by the people. He meant a lot to them. And also congratulations to your many alumni here who did this initiative. So David has a lot of fans, but himself is not really a fan of this whole Pillar 2 thing, right?
I think that's fair, yes. I haven't.
I don't really, David, I don't really have to hear much more because I believe you if you say it's not good. But could you explain to us a bit more why?
It's probably good in some sense. It's the problem that I have with it is it meshes very uneasily with the U.S. tax system, and I frankly haven't wanted to spend the time to figure out all the problems that implementing it for U.S. companies would entail. But I suspect that there are quite a few problems. In fact, from what little I read in the literature, I see there are quite a few. And also, I would say this, I have very little doubt, by the way, that there is going to be a Pillar 2 development in many countries. It sounds to me like that's pretty much a done deal. But I think it's very hard to see that happening in the United States. Passing tax legislation of any kind in the United States is very, very, very hard today. And that adopting a new treaty is probably even harder. So I don't see, there's always surprises, but I don't see the US signing on to this anytime soon. Doesn't preclude other countries from doing it. But I see a lot of cross-border disputes arising as a result of this initiative. And I'm not sure we have the tools available to resolve those disputes. So I'm sort of a pessimist for where all this is going, but I'm certainly an interested observer.
We will get to the disputes and the expected dispute resolution just a minute, but do you see at least like the US moving on guilty to make guilty a bit more palatable?
That would require legislation. I mean, I just don't think the Congress of the United States is going to pass tax legislation. For one thing, the timing of that today, at least, is, there's a very short window before the Congress of the United States goes to sleep for 5 or 6 months.
Yeah.
And I just don't see much happen. There's no momentum that I can see for the administration. And I just have very strong doubts. I've always had strong doubts, but as time passes, the available window of opportunity for passing legislation, we're in the middle of May. I think you can pretty well assume that by August, the Congress won't be able to do anything. They'll be all tied up in the forthcoming election.
Right, and you have midterms coming up, so.
Yeah, it's the election really makes this a very short year. Now, if you look beyond the election, then you get into prognostication about which parties will be in charge. I don't detect any interest in this project on the Republican side, any at all. Maybe I'm missing something, but I don't think so. And you'll have a Democratic administration for another 2 years. If either house of Congress goes Republican, it's hopeless as far as I can see. Just about.
And I suppose, David, that applies as well to Pillar 1, right?
Oh, especially to Pillar 1. Pillar 1
especially Pillar 1.
There's no question Pillar 1 isn't going anywhere. I mean, that's from a sophisticated U.S. standpoint, I think that really is a non-starter. Pillar 2, let me put it this way. Anything that the United States can do without legislation or a treaty, I think is possible. But there's not much that the United States can do. It can't change guilty. It can't enter into binding international agreements. It's very, very difficult to see anything, I mean, if our law is accepted as it stands and just plugged into a worldwide system, then I think you could say, okay, the U.S. is participating. If it requires the U.S. to do anything, I don't see it.
Let me just move for a minute to Stephen. Stephen, you please don't answer if you think that this question probably is premature or whatever. But David was saying that there are things that the US could do outside passing legislation or treaties, because that obviously requires a vote in Congress. But what could the US do outside legislation to actually have a system in the US that would be more or less, or at least, let's say, closer to the projected globe?
Thanks. And that's a question that I'll have to probably give a bit of a high-level answer on, I suppose, is probably the best way to put it. I think in the GLOBE rules, we describe what a qualified income inclusion rule should look like. And I think guilty coexistence is still something that is to be done as part of the implementation framework. And if I have a few minutes at the end, I'm happy to provide an update on overall next steps with respect to the implementation framework. As you can imagine, there's quite a lot that goes into that with the inclusive framework jurisdictions to reach a consensus on the forthcoming guidance. I think that that really, if you look at what it takes to reach the level of a qualified income inclusion rule, there are certain key components to that, right? When you look through the rules to get there. And as far as what the U.S. can do without legislating, even though I have a U.S. tax background, sitting here from the OECD perspective,
I respect that.
To answer that.
No, I do respect that. I understand it. But David, just one question, if I may. We have this qualified domestic top-up tax, which would be introduced by a number of countries, etc. Of course, the Pillar 2 does not have any arbitration, let alone binding arbitration, unlike Pillar 2. In the qualified domestic top-up tax, there is something where the OECD diplomatically tries to say that they would help countries determine whether that is an accepted tax or not. It's very short of arbitration, actually, but it is a step towards some kind of, if they would introduce binding arbitration within Pillar 2, would that help the US move along, or would you still foresee problems?
Well, there are still some problems because we can't just enter into binding arbitration without some kind of authorization, and that probably entails changing treaties. In fact, it certainly entails changing treaties. We have binding arbitration in place in, I think it's now 7 of our tax treaties. And we just added 3 a couple of years ago, 2019. But we can't, for example, do arbitration, binding arbitration. We can't do anything with a country with which we have no tax treaty, nothing. We can't even talk to them. So if you're talking about Brazil, for example, without well, we do have an exchange of information agreement with Brazil, but without a treaty, I think it would be pretty hard for the United States to enter into any kind of agreement with Brazil.
So basically,
a lot of big countries that we have a lot of investment, we have absolutely nothing in place. We don't have a big network of treaties. I mean, we're having, we've spent 10 years trying to get the treaty with Chile into place. It's really kind of, I don't think the world really appreciates.
Actually, the Chileans
come in.
Actually, the Chileans were very nice. They actually took a measure that would allow the application of reduced rate, or is it the exclusion from the US from some negative adverse tax rule? Even though the treaty is still not in force, they still said, okay, we will apply to the US anyway. Which
I think
is
you're
nice
talking about they entered into a reservation to change, to address the problems that the Treasury had. That's a long story. We don't have time for it. But having done that, Congress hasn't scheduled a vote on the treaty. So, the situation in the United States with respect to treaties are even harder to get in place than legislation. Because if you have one party in control and you've got 51 votes, you can get legislation through the Senate, which is the main stumbling block. If you have one party controlling both houses. If you have the split in the houses, I don't see how you get to do anything, but we'll see. Right. On treaties, one senator can and has held up the whole treaty process since 2012. So I mean, you got 10 years in which the United States, I think the last US treaty was approved was actually, I think it was 2010. Wow. So it doesn't bode well for doing anything by treaties.
Do you think
including new arbitration provisions? I'm a big fan of mandatory arbitration. I'm sure we'll go there in this conversation, but we can't just put it in place because Pillar 2, countries want to do Pillar 2. Right. We have to have
let me just turn to Porus for a minute. Porus, thank you for staying with us. I know that you have other obligations. Just on this area of binding arbitration. So we have binding arbitration. Basically, we have it in. I'm sorry, everybody. I didn't even introduce you because I assume everybody knows you. Porus is a senior advocate. Is a Harvard alumni, and he is the former president of Worldwide IFA. He was here for the IFA Congress in Rio de Janeiro, I think. How many already? 4 years ago? Something like that? 5. 2017. All right. And Gustavo Brigagao still has the baby face after. Right. So, Porus, would countries like India and China, would they live with binding arbitration for Pillar 2?
I think India is extremely clear that it is not going to accept binding arbitration. I think it's not going to accept it in its treaties, and I don't think it will accept it in Pillar 2. For Pillar 1, there is a kind of a medium or a middle road path that the OECD is trying to find between what really is required to work out Pillar 1 and ultimately the position of some of the countries, including Asia and perhaps India and perhaps China, which is they call it a dispute resolution mechanism. The contours of it are not completely clear, but it appears to be that this will be a mechanism which will be a multilateral mechanism, which will be primarily dominated by the members of the revenue of each country. And they won't be sort of independent outside academics or arbitrators who will sit and judge this dispute. And this is for determining amount C, or the amount to be allocated outside to the market countries. So to the extent of arbitration, India hasn't moved, but on this alternative dispute mechanism, there has been a shift, and I think there's a realization that if there is no shift, perhaps that entire Pillar 1, which I think India is interested in, may not take off. But arbitration, I think there's still, I think, unfortunately, consensus that it would not be acceptable.
Especially after the latest experience of India with arbitration and their investment treaties, right? With Cairn Energy, and it's been, I think, it's been too painful for the government to.
Yes, but I think realistically, I think those arbitrations you should look as a completely separate shell, because they were based on a retrospective legislation. And I think they just had particularly difficult facts. And I don't think, even as a country, we should look at them as sort of setting the trend or precedent for other tax issues on which perhaps you could have a more fundamental, better position.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Just going back to David and maybe Stephen, I think it concerns you. Maybe the question would be relevant to both of you. We've just mentioned earlier that CFC taxes would be considered to determine the effective tax rate, right? What are the prospects of at least considering that guilty is the equivalent of a CFC? And that whatever tax is levied by the US under guilty, at least would be considered as a covered tax.
Is that to me or to Stephen?
Either of you. I mean, you're free to.
Well, let me start by explaining what I think is the problem here, the main problem. I mean, guilty is clearly a CFC tax. It only applies in the case of CFCs. The problem with guilty, I think, although I admit I have not followed this closely, the problem with guilty from the standpoint of other countries is that guilty treats a U.S. shareholders' CFCs as if they, essentially, as if they were all one CFC. So that, in other words, if you are a U.S. company, you've got a subsidiary, and let's take our countries represented here, Spain, India, Costa Rica, and France, we would, for guilty purposes, we would essentially blend the results.
It's
so
not
that
per jurisdiction. It is not
well,
per
yes, so if
jurisdiction.
we had a loss in Spain, but we had positive income in the French subsidiary, the loss in Spain would reduce the amount of guilty that comes in from the French subsidiary. And that's the way. Guilty does not apply at the foreign subsidiary level. Guilty applies at the U.S. shareholder level.
Yes, and it blends everything.
It's very different from subpart F.
All right. But, okay, so for that reason, that's why most people are saying that guilty does not really qualify as an IIR. You know, it's not, as a globe, it does not. Because
I don't know.
Because the
That's
minimum
Stephen, not
effective
me.
tax should be at jurisdictional level, and even for some things at an entity level, not even a jurisdiction level. But just for other countries to consider whether, low-taxed U.S. entity, if there is already guilty there, if guilty is basically treated as a CFC, then it would, the guilty rate, what is it now, 10.5? The 10.5 would increase the effective tax rate, and you get closer to the 15% maybe, right?
Well, guilty would be 12.5 as of 2026. It goes up by two.
Okay.
If nothing happens, and I suspect nothing will happen.
Yeah.
Go up by 2.5%.
Yeah.
But yes, look, guilty only applies to controlled foreign corporations. So from that standpoint, you can say it is like subpart F.
Right.
The problem is that it blends the results of multiple subsidiaries. And if you're talking about having a minimum tax in each jurisdiction, it gets pretty complicated to figure out how to assign a guilty tax if you have 10 subsidiaries.
If you have, some of them have like hundreds of subsidiaries. And how are you I mean, at least, even at the jurisdiction level, let's assume you are in 80 jurisdictions, how are you going to assign the guilty to the 80 jurisdictions, All right.
Well, there's a blending both of results, both on the income side, and there's a blending of foreign tax credits, which is also a problem. I mean, one of the things about Pillar 2, and I'm talking too much, so let me just make this one point, and then I'll leave it to Stephen. One of the problems with Pillar 2 from a U.S. perspective is that our system is really complicated. And I just don't see how you mesh our system with what's being discussed in Pillar 2. I just don't. I know that people have written about this and thought about it, but I see lots of problems.
Understood. Thank you so much, David. Let me please move to Porus because he has other obligations. Porus, I don't even know where to start with you because you are going to talk to us a little bit about the Asia Pacific perspective on this, and it is a very mixed bag. You have like countries which are maybe at the forefront of this effort, like Australia. You have traditional low-tax jurisdictions like Singapore or Hong Kong or even Malaysia. So what can you tell us about the perspective from Asia Pacific?
Thank you. I think I can just borrow one of David's words, which is it's extremely complicated. but when you look at the subject, at least the subject that was presented for us, and I want to, at this point in time, thank the organizers personally for inviting me. I have extremely fond memories of Rio and know that there is no better place to party than in Rio. But coming back to a more serious thing, when you look at the subject, which is the sovereignty issue and the global minimum tax, or Pillar 1 on Pillar 2, both together, I think both have significant sovereignty issues for all countries involved. I'm not saying it seriously because, frankly, even a treaty has a sovereignty issue. So I don't think there's anything wrong in compromising, but it has serious issues. But when you get to Pillar 2, which is a minimum rate of tax, you're absolutely going at the core of a sovereignty of jurisdictions. Again, not passing judgment. I think coming from a a high tax jurisdiction, I think it's probably a good thing for the rest of the world. But I can certainly see some of the pushback from some of the so-called low tax jurisdictions. When you look at Asia, again, it's a mixed bag. So as of November 21, and Stephen can update us if there's any change, there are about 137 members who have agreed to Pillar 2. And you will find that out of the 11 that did not sign up, nearly 4 were Asian countries. And surprisingly, you won't find many of them being the main suspects. It wasn't a UAE or a Singapore who was not signing up, but it was actually Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Philippines, and Kuwait for reasons that they had of their own. When you come to the rates, one of the greatest, I think, changes that is happening in my region that I can see is with the pressure that is growing, you already have a country like United Arab Emirates, which had absolutely zero rates of income tax, promising that from 2023, there will be a minimum rate of 9% for entities within its jurisdiction, and also saying that there will be different rules for multinationals. And that's possibly the advent of Pillar 2, which could be even a higher rate. So UAE never even had an income tax. And this is obviously spurred by the global debate. And I think the 9% becomes, and I think Stephen can explain that, but 9% is really a result of the STTR and the reflection of that. But this kind of pressure and the movement is certainly pushing some of the jurisdictions from the OECD statistics again, and I'm a little surprised at some of the figures that I see. They have about, this is on their webpage, they have given the effective tax rates of Asian countries currently as UAE 0, 9% from 2023, and Singapore, Mauritius being at 17 and 15%, which again surprises me a little. I'm assuming this is just an average of the tax rate. This is not the effective tax rate that we are looking at in Pillar 2. And then, of course, the other countries are much higher, like India at 25%, Japan at 29%, China at 25%. But when you look at Pillar 2, again, there are two parts, as Stephen explained. One is the working of the 15% and all those rules and the STTR. But certainly for countries which view themselves as source countries, whether it would be an India or a China, I think it is the STTR which has the greater interest than the other parts of Pillar 2. And also, we do have a significant interest in Pillar 1. But we see these all together. It's going to be incredibly complex. David, if your US system is incredibly complex, I can't imagine what the world is going to look like 3 years from now, because you're going to have your transfer pricing, you're going to have you're going to have your bilateral treaty. On top of your bilateral treaty will be the MLI. On top of the MLI will be sitting Pillar 1, Pillar 2, and the globe rules. So it's going to be a difficult world out there. But I think a significant part of the developing world is moving along with this flow or along with this river. But if, for example, there is a dam on Pillar 1 from the United States, I'm not sure where we'll all end up and which kind of tributaries we'll end up in. That's all I have.
Good question. Now, Asia Pacific, obviously, I mean, not everywhere, but it's pretty heavy on tax incentives, right? To help basically build national industries and for the purpose of national development. China, even India, basically, but also many of the smaller economies in the region. Do you see that the carve-outs are enough to safeguard tax incentives that are meant for national development?
Well, again, this I think is a better question for Stephen, because I'm not sure exactly how they propose to even define that, or they're going to have a definition for that. For example, take the carve-outs of the organizations that are not covered. Let's just look at that. It's non-profit and charitable. Now, this will depend on the country's classification. Will you have a charitable organization rule? Obviously, there isn't probably right now. You can't sort of define it globally. But even the current carve-outs, as I see, perhaps how you define one may be an issue, or perhaps you just leave it open for the national governments. But on the national development things, I perhaps would defer to Stephen to see whether they propose to look at a certain category or a criteria to define what will meet the test or not meet the test for the rules.
Yeah, and I suppose, Stephen, in this case, is basically the substance requirement, right?
So here with and I think you were referring, Dali, right, to the substance-based carve-out, and exactly right. That's designed to exactly carve out from the globe base, essentially a routine return in a jurisdiction. And I'll note that there is a 10-year phase-in period where the carve-out is actually more substantial than it will be in the steady state. To allow for this transition period and for jurisdictions, if they want to change their tax incentives, to do so in that time period. And then I'll also note, in addition to that, there are other ways in which the globe rules accommodate some differences. And one of those is through the adoption of the deferred tax accounting approach with respect to covered taxes. So, for example, where there are book-to-tax differences in the timing of recognizing income for financial accounting purposes, which is the globe base, and for local tax purposes, in the design of the rules, there's this deferred tax accounting mechanism. So, for example, if you're depreciating an asset faster for tax purposes in a jurisdiction than you are for financial accounting purposes, that's okay, and credit is given in the rules, so that on its own doesn't cause a top-up tax. So I think there is a good bit in the rules to protect that. The first and foremost being the substance-based carve-out, which just carves out essentially a deemed routine return based on tangible assets and payroll in a jurisdiction. And then secondly, for these timing differences between book and tax, having the deferred tax accounting approach there as well acts as a bit of a resource there as well.
All right. Yeah, thank you. And turning to Diego for a minute. Diego, same issue for a number of Latin American countries, right?
But yes, first of all, let me just thank you very briefly.
I'm sorry, let me first introduce you.
Okay.
Diego Salto is from Costa Rica. He is actually he's a partner with the Legal Consortium, which is a very respected law firm. I believe you are in all Central American countries, right?
Yes, we do.
I don't want to say a stupid thing. 6 Central American countries, right? Or is it 5?
We're in 5 Central American
You are
countries.
in 5.
We don't have an office in Panama, but it is true. We are all through the Central American region.
Okay, great. And besides that, he is actually also the chairman of IFA LATAM. All right. So thanks, Diego, and thanks for waiting all this time to get a word.
It's been very interesting, and obviously our economies actually rely on everything that you have been explaining and everyone from the panel has been describing. First of all, let me just go back and thank the Asociación Brasileira de Direito Financeiro, and especially Marco André Viña-Catón for inviting me. Let me just give you very briefly a different approach from a Central American or Latin American perspective. Basically, I'll say that I subscribe mostly everything that Porus mentioned. Our region is very different. Obviously, we cannot compare Brazil and then a Central American country, or even Brazil and Colombia or Peru. So the fact that how the different countries are approaching this subject, it is very different. Let me say that I'll say that when this was approved an inclusive network, the approval from the Latin American countries was basically a passive approval. I'll say that at the end probably will be kind of a FOMO, a fear of missing out and not standing out, and everyone approved. And as it says that
maybe they thought it would not affect them. Maybe they thought it would not affect them.
On the other hand, they told them they were going to get some more revenue, and obviously every single treasury ministry will like and will love to get some more revenue. But as we say, the devil is in the details, and when the breaking details of everything has been disclosed, there are a lot of problems for the Latin American countries. And the first one, and let me just point this out, is that we are importers of capital, most of the countries, not all of them. But these rules are intended mostly for countries that are export capital. So countries like Uruguay, Dominican Republic, Panama, Costa Rica, or even Colombia, that we actually receive a lot of foreign direct investment, we need to figure out what are we going to do to stand out through our incentive projects or regimes that, as a matter of fact, has to be said, has already been approved by the OECD because they approve it through Action Plan number 5. So one of the main challenges that we have right now is how are we going to be facing this? I'll say, probably for the sake of the time, that the most important conclusion right now is that from a Latin American perspective, is going to be wait and see. No one is going to be willing to be the first one on the front row. We are willing, and this is something that I actually confirmed with several colleagues from several of our countries. The only things that has been going on in the Latin American countries is the constitution of task force groups in many countries, Uruguay, Mexico, Colombia, Costa Rica. I've been actually personally working with the agency in charge of attracting investment in Costa Rica. And just to give you a couple of numbers, 53% of the exports of Costa Rica actually depend on the free trade zone regime. And one of the things that Stephen was mentioning is very important. All of that operation has substance. So we're relying also on the details of the carve-out processes. And moreover, we're taking the opportunity, I think, and this is something of the message that from a tax perspective and fiscal policy perspective, Latin American country has to face is, can we take the opportunity of moving forward and evolving and trying to also focus on some of the things. I know the catch grants are not being approved by the OECD as a general, but there are several kinds of grants that may eventually be useful for education in the countries. And how can our countries be appealed for international investment, even if we don't have tax incentives? And that's basically where we are. trying to give some more credits on research and development, and moreover, giving tax certainty by subscribing more tax treaties in the region. I think that's one of the homeworks that, from a Latin American perspective, we're still missing. And in addition, the nearshoring process that basically when David was speaking about this, we're relying on the U.S. Because most of the Latin American countries rely on the U.S. foreign investment. And I can tell you that at least the Central American countries, they receive 70% of their FDI come from the U.S. So the fact that the U.S. will not be able or eager to approve this pillar number 2 will somehow put a question mark on how are we going to approach this matter in our countries. And the first thing, once again, is certainty. We need to be able to provide the investors in Costa Rica mostly, or the Latin American region, some of them from a US perspective or European perspective, the certainty that everything that they have signed with their respective countries will be somehow safeguarded and will be maintained. So that's basically where I think Dali is the approach from Latin American countries. And let me just finish with 2 very, very quick comments.
I'll get back to you. Back to you, Diego. Just wanted to, Stephen, I'm not picking up on you, but again, the substance carve-outs, are they the same criteria as they are for Action 5 BEPS?
The substance carve-outs in the
substance carve-outs under Pillar 1, are they exactly the same as the criteria for Action Point 5 of the BEPS package?
So the substance carve-outs in Pillar 2 are actually defined in the GLOBE rules.
Yes, but are they based on BEPS Action 5, or is there a difference between both?
I would need to go back and look at the definition in Action 5. I would believe there are some differences.
Action 5 is
Yeah, I'm familiar with Action 5. I just don't have it in front of me to compare. But given that these rules were drafted by the Inclusive Framework in Working Party 11, and the definitions for the tangible assets and payroll were the subject of negotiation in the Working Party, I would imagine there are some differences. Exactly what the differences are is something that I would need to compare the 2 to speak to. But the GLOBE concept of a substance carve-out is unique to GLOBE.
Right. And it is a bit more limited under GLOBE than it is for basically the harmful, the harmful tax competition thing under Action 5. All right, thank you. Diego, please, go ahead.
No, but let me just end up with kind of a comment, and it's for our countries, which are basically importers of capital. I think the most important thing right now is certainty. And let me just put a couple of scenarios. Let's say that this goes on. If this goes on, the most important fact for us is how are we going to be managing our current regimes in most of these countries, which is something that is very important. Let me give you a couple of numbers I was looking at. In Uruguay, for every $1 of tax credit or exemption that is given, they receive 6 out of them of the benefit of having those type of companies in the country. In Costa Rica, for every single $1 that is being given, they receive $2.42. So the fact that they contribute to the country obviously is something that can be proved. Obviously, the fact that it somehow generates some distortion within the global tax system is something that, as a matter of fact, is what we're discussing right now. So there has to be a substitution of what those countries are going to be doing, and basically to get some more knowledgeable on how are we going to be improving this. But if this does not go on because the U.S. does not support this, or even if in the European Union someone goes not with the bunch, and they don't have unanimity with the 27 countries. The problem with us will be that our largest investors will have unilateral measures. And therefore, this is something that will still go on. And I think Professor Rosenbloom mentioned that even if it's not in the US, this is something that will still go on in the future. And that's probably one of the things that we're going to be facing. The Inter-American Center for the Tax Administration actually issued a document recently, and they said that for developed countries, this will represent an increase in revenue of 19%. But for developing countries, it would only be for 2%. And obviously, this is an average for all the developing countries. So we're recipients of these measures. And as they will say, this is something that us, as developing countries, we need to pay it because this is kind of an accession royalty that we're paying to be part of the global market. And therefore, we're spectators. We need to just figure out, actually, and that was the reason I was very happy to be part of this panel and listen to Roberta, to Porus, to Stephen, and to Professor Rosenbloom, is what are the other countries going to be doing? And this is something that Latin America will be basically abstracting and trying to figure out how to approach this matter.
Great. Thank you, Diego. Basically, if I would sum it up, is more resignation than enthusiasm for this. Let me please just turn back to Porus. Porus, can I maybe have a last word? I know that you need to leave. So can I have maybe a last word from you? And then we'll have a last word from everybody and give Stephen also a chance to react on some of what has been said. How do you see this? How do you see this going?
No, sorry, I didn't miss it.
How do you see this going?
You mean the entire Pillar 1, Pillar 2 proposals?
Yeah.
Well, I think the entire world is, as I said earlier, I think the entire world is moving along. It's like a fast-moving stream. Everyone's in it. No one wants to get out at this stage. The only person who's really not in it with his feet, as David pointed out, is the United States. I do believe the administration is currently in it at this present time from what public says, but David has certainly more knowledge of that. But there seems to be a lot of rush and a lot of pressure. There is most countries have something in the basket, either in Pillar 1 or Pillar 2. They do have something in the basket for them. But I think from everyone's interest, it's definitely a very complicated set of proposals. But should the United States eventually decide not to be a part of it, unfortunately, many countries will go ahead with this unilaterally, at least from their digital taxes point of view. And you're going to have a very, very fragmented world order.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Porus. Anyone would like to, maybe a last word from David?
Well, yeah, the only point I would make that I haven't so far is that my perception, and this is born of speaking in lots of different countries, I think people don't really appreciate how the United States governs itself. You probably have read about it, but most people in most countries are used to systems in which the governing administration, if not controls legislation, has a huge amount of power with respect to legislation. So, and that you get that with a parliamentary system. And I think my impression is most countries have some form of parliamentary system. We do not. And I would simply say, don't confuse the US administration with the United States. That confusion is made all the time. I know that the Treasury is very much in favor of Pillar 1, and this Treasury in particular, of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. I know that Ms. Yellen is out talking to Poland and trying to bring them on side within the European Union. I know all that. I read enough of the papers to see all that. But I don't think, from what I can see, that the Congress of the United States has A, really been brought into this very well, or B, even if an effort was made to bring it in, that it would go into it willingly. And given the degree of political dysfunction in the United States Congress, I can't overemphasize the difficulty of getting pretty much anything done that requires them to act. That's why I say, if you can figure out a way to move this forward without the need for either legislation or a treaty, I think, at least in this administration, you get enthusiastic response. But if it requires Congress, your odds of getting anything done drop dramatically. And it's because of the way our system functions.
Very clear, thank you. Stephen, is there anything that has been said so far which you think reflects a misunderstanding from any of the speakers of what you intend to do or what the rules say?
Perhaps I can respond to some of the comments and also provide a bit of a recap in closing as to where we're headed next. I certainly heard the speakers mention dispute resolution. That is something that the jurisdictions involved are very much aware of, the need for tax certainty and the ability to resolve cross-border disputes in a expeditious and consistent manner. As part of the implementation framework, we'll be working with the inclusive framework jurisdictions on various categories, including administrative guidance. We'll be prioritizing the need for guidance around the transition rules and the most pressing of issues, working with the jurisdictions on how information is collected and reported. We had a public consultation earlier in April that perhaps some of you saw. We had a very significant number of submissions, many of which highlighting the need for standardized returns and information exchanges. We're working on safe harbors, reviewing feedback there, and then certainly on the rule coordination and tax certainty. It is obviously a monumental shift, Pillar 2, it's a milestone in global tax policy to have all of these countries signed up. As mentioned, the 137 countries that did sign up to the statement. Obviously there's a lot that needs to be done to implement under domestic law, and that our work is certainly very much ongoing as this process unfolds, to provide the support here from the OECD Secretariat as we can, working with these jurisdictions on the implementation framework so that Pillar 2, where implemented, is implemented in a consistent fashion, and that taxpayers, to the greatest extent possible, can expect certainty. It's really been a pleasure to join the other speakers on the panel this afternoon, and I found that their comments very insightful. So thank you for having me.
All right. Well, Stephen, thank you. Basically, yeah, myself, I would say, I do have issues with some of the proposals, et cetera, but the technical quality of the work that has been delivered so far, the advancement of the process so far, I think it's stellar, and that I think you're responsible for that result. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. I'm just one of a team, so it goes to but thank you very much. I will relay that.
All right. So Roberta, David, Diego, Stephen, Porus, it's been a pleasure to exchange with you this way. I hope next time it would be in person. Thank you all, and apologies for the timing issue. But it's been a real pleasure to exchange with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your leadership.
Thank you.
Thanks to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. All right.
Especially you.
You want to marry me, that's why.
No. Sensation.